Welcome to episode 325 of the Baunfire Gaming Podcast. I'm your host, Morgan, aka Baun Diesel, and this week we'll be talking about Microsoft's new Muse technology, PlayStation executive reveals all, kind of, industry and analyst thoughts on the future of gaming, and much more. Before we get started, subscribe to the Baunfire Gaming Podcast on your favorite podcast app. Leave a review on Spotify or iTunes, and subscribe to the Baun Diesel YouTube channel to get all of my videos, including this podcast. Thank you to everyone who supports as YouTube members and Twitch subscribers. If you are interested in supporting this show and all of my other content, please check out the links in the show description. You can now leave a comment on Spotify episodes, leave a comment on the YouTube videos, or join my Discord to chat with other listeners about all of this news and more. Let's get into the gaming news with the main story. Microsoft reveals Muse, which is a generative AI model trained on Ninja Theory's Bleeding Edge. This was kind of interesting. I don't think anyone who's been paying attention should be surprised by this. Microsoft has invested extremely heavily into generative AI. I believe OpenAI was the kind of big model that they had invested the most with and had deals with. I don't know if they still do have those deals or not. But you know, it's interesting. I'm mixed on this stuff. The honest truth is I don't really know enough about it to know whether I don't like it or not. And I saw a lot of people kind of shooting from the hip, kind of being like, hey, all AI is bad. I think any AI that is going to negatively affect actual game developers sucks. I would say that is bad. I would agree. My issue comes with, if there's a world where this stuff can happen and people aren't made redundant, right? And it's not even made redundant because this stuff is better. The thing that concerns me the most is that this generative AI stuff, like what percentage of performance would it need to match, like creativity or whatever, from a real person for a big corporation to feel like it's worth the loss in quality and originality and creativity? Where's the line, right? If the generative AI is 50% as good as a real person, is that worth it? 75, 90, 95, like where does it have to be for them to say yes? This AI model that is still expensive but cheaper than paying a person, and dealing and something you can use 24/7, that doesn't need time off, or can't only work an 8-hour day. At what point are they willing to accept that it's going to be lower quality to get the advantage, right? And I guess that's what worries me the most. The idea of AI in general, AI at one point was called machine learning, right? Or at least the AI that many of us think about. And for a long time, that has been part of the game industry and game development and many other things as well, right? The issue is this generative thing where instead of being, a tool that, kind of, the machine learning side of things that does what that does, this is taking, other people's art and learning from it and using what it learned to make its own, even though then you get into all the conversations that are legit about, is generative AI creative, or is it just mishmashing other people's content to make its own, and it's not making anything original? That's obviously, can an AI be original, right? Especially when everything it knows is trained on original content. So that's where people are upset. In this case, they trained this AI on Bleeding Edge, a game Ninja Theory made a long time ago. And sorry about the yawn there. So I don't know. This is supposedly the first quantum computing tech that has been publicly shown, or at least at this scale. In a situation this prolific. If you want me to be totally honest, I think that they're just using Xbox as a trailer for this right now to be like, look, this can do some game things. Where I highly doubt the final goal for this tech is to help make games. Specifically, what was presented here was that it could take games that maybe the code base for the game has been lost, or the rights to it, are weird, or the engine, no one knows how to work on the engine anymore for a game. That you could use this Muse model to give it a bunch of to train it on a game where maybe you have some footage of the game that's left. You feed that into it and it can recreate that game. That doesn't seem likely. Like, I think at the end of the day, many of these conversations are kind of hampered by the idea that, like, this isn't gonna happen. Like nothing's going to happen with this, at least not anytime soon. I just, I guess maybe I'm just tired. Maybe I'm just worn out among many other things going on in the world. This is one of those things where, I've seen so many people upset about AI and so many people pushing it. I tend to notice that the people who are pushing it, I don't really care to associate with. The people who are against it are people I tend to agree with. But that doesn't mean I should just, take their thoughts and copy them. I guess my take on it is coming down to one way or the other, whether it's machine learning or generative AI or whatever, it's going to continue to proliferate the industry. And I think that the smartest thing people can do is to make sure that people are protected. That's why I'm glad and I'm really proud of the voice actors union or whatever, continuing to fight all the big game companies to ensure that they won't be replaced by this kind of tech. And hopefully we see that from other parts of the industry as well. Yeah, we'll see how that goes. I still kind of feel like this was just a, hey, look at this thing that we have, that will end up not really being, focused on gaming anyways, but it was a good way for them to reveal it, I guess. They may not have realized that it would probably not be as exciting for a lot of the people they're targeting, but I think that we can say that Microsoft in recent years has not been too worried about that. So we'll see. With some other stories this week, Shuyu Toshida was spilling the beans. So this is a former PlayStation executive who recently retired. Talked about all kinds of stuff. How Jim Ryan basically forced him into this indie job that he was put into and retired from. I believe. I want to say he was the head of like PlayStation Studios before that, or it was like relationships or something. I can't remember what it was, but basically he was forced into it. That he didn't really want to make that move, and was invited to leave if he didn't want to. Jim Ryan has really probably cemented himself to many PlayStation fans as not their best leader, maybe. And we're seeing the repercussions of that now as time goes on, with the way that this live service push seemingly like really hurt PlayStation. Even though they're still doing great financially, it seems like they're fine. It's the repercussions in the long run may be tough if this push and all the studios who wasted time and resources on it for it not to really go anywhere, with this live service thing. We'll see how that plays out in the long run. Hey, he's talked about how the Japan studios, the Japan PlayStation studio, was closed because of the double A market was disappearing. That's a wild statement to me because I feel like that like double A market is never bigger than it's ever been. So maybe at the time that it happened, that's the way it was going. I think that may have been a mistake, but we'll never know. And then his kind of insight about how From Software, who they've been trying to acquire recently, didn't want PlayStation to publish Dark Souls because of how they treated Demon Souls. So they had the exclusive rights to Demon Souls, and it sounds like basically that From Software didn't really like the way they handled it, the way they marketed it, and just the way it was treated in general by the platform. So that stuff was all kind of interesting. He's really been shooting from the hip ever since he left. He's probably causing a lot of executives a lot of headaches around the industry right now, because he's really been spilling the beans lately. I can't really tell if he's like got a bone to pick or if he's just enjoying the attention. But good for him either way. I hope he enjoys his retirement. As someone who never plans on retiring, I just kind of assume I'll play until I play. Well, I'll probably play games until I die, but I'll probably work until I die as well. So we'll leave that on a high note. NetEase is pulling back on investments in studios. This is a thing that, if you've been paying attention to the industry, especially for the last year or so, this seems obvious. NetEase is kind of like Tencent, where they've straight up, they straight up own a bunch of studios that make games, but they also do these like like what seem to be fairly small investments into various publishers and studios, and then they've kind of spread that influence, and also helped start up and fund newer studios. Well, that seems like they're changing their mind on that. Apparently, the CEO of NetEase is so determined to basically focus on things that make a ton of money that they almost didn't actually finish Marvel Rivals, which is gigantic right now. I can't talk about Marvel Rivals without mentioning that as part of this pullback deal, NetEase shut down the Seattle studio that helped develop on Marvel Rivals and had this story was weird. It was like kind of pumped up a lot when it first came out. Obviously, now it kind of seems like it was only a team of like a dozen people. Still, a dozen people losing their jobs sucks. But their main dev team for Rivals is over in China, and this was a satellite team. I don't know what they did. I don't know what their responsibilities were, but it still was kind of strange that this game that's like completely popped off is shutting down any studios, even if it's a fairly small one outside of their home country. But that kind of is what it is. If you're a BioWare fan who listens, you'll know that like Mac Walters left BioWare last year to go, to lead a studio. That studio is now looking for new funding, and unfortunately, the fate of that studio is probably not too hard to speculate on, unless he gets lucky and finds funding. That was NetEase, as well as Casey Hudson had a Humanoid Origin studio, which he broke away from and started, it was 3-4 years ago, or more at this point. Seems like they had a full AAA dev team running and doing their thing and working on whatever they were going to put out, and now it's dead, it's gone, which is weird. We haven't heard from Casey Hudson or anyone really, or any updates about that studio, what's going on with it. I assume it's gone, but it still has a presence in some capacity. As far as I can tell, Casey Hudson's been radio silent since it happened. At this point, the only actual announcement we have was from LinkedIn, from the Humanoid Origin LinkedIn website, or account, who said that they were doing the layoffs, and then shared, I think, some like Excel or Google Sheets listings showing everyone who they're hoping to get hired to other studios. So this whole thing with NetEase and Tencent and all that, like I think everyone just kind of assumed that was like not free money, but that they would always be there. And at least with NetEase so far, they seem like they're pulling back, and Tencent could very well do the same. Tencent is kind of interesting. I believe it's Tencent who has a pretty big investment in Larian Studios, who made the Baldur's Gate 3. They may keep that one. That sounds like it was probably a good investment. But they also have deals with like Ubisoft, who is suffering from their own issues right now, and supposedly talking to Tencent and some other kind of venture capitalist companies, or some money people, to potentially sell off some of their IP or some of their studios or their whole company, their whole publisher. Who knows? Yves Guillemot is really playing the wild card lately. So I mean, this is probably going to have pretty big impacts on video games. I don't think people realize how many studios these kind of folks are invested into, and that it's probably going to be a pretty big deal if they are no longer investing. My Avowed thoughts on. I rolled credits, so I wanted to talk a little bit about it. No spoilers. Don't worry about that. Um, I really liked it. I plan on doing more of a review video next week, so be on the lookout for that on my YouTube at Bon Diesel. Um, it's a game that if you are willing to go into it kind of blind and just willing to just experience Avowed however you experience it, I think you'll come out being like, wow, that was super cool. I think if you go into it being like, I want this to be cyberpunk, but in Skyrim or something, you're probably going to be disappointed. This is not that game. This game is what seems to be the kind of culminating uh, vision of Obsidian when it comes to their RPGs to a point. This is a game that you are playing this open world ish RPG. It does resemble Skyrim or some other games that you would think of. But you can't steal from people. You can't take their horse. You can't murder the village full of people indiscriminately. There's a bunch of, you can't really romance anyone. You can't, there's all of these things about this type of game that you have come to expect if you're kind of functioning in the same world as me. And it's interesting because it seems like if people fixated on those things, they didn't like Avowed. For me, I jumped in kind of assuming I wouldn't like it, so I had no expectations. It was probably a very fortunate thing for me, because then I got into the combat and said, wow, that feels really good. Then I got into the companions, which, are kind of hit or miss, but I think Kai, who's voiced by Brandon Keener of either Mass Effect Garrus fame or the Division Isaac fame, if you didn't know. Um, for me, what happened with Avowed is that, like I said, I went in kind of expecting to probably not like it. I'm not really into high fantasy games. I really don't like first person games as much, or at least not in this genre. And then, yeah, I shot my first arrow. I swung my first sword. I parried for the first time. And man, I got really into it. Almost entirely just because of the combat. The combat feels very good, very rewarding, very punchy. I like the companions. I've seen that's like one of the big criticisms is that people didn't like the companions or didn't feel like things were reactive enough in the story. I don't know. I liked them. I thought the companions were fine. I'm not gonna. I liked Kai and Giada. I didn't really like Yatsli or Marius. I thought they were kind of annoying, especially Yatsli. I would throw that thing into the ocean if I could, um, but you can't because it's not that type of game, right? Um, yeah, I think that the story it tells is really good. I love the way it concluded, and I'd be so curious to see other people's playthroughs or even redo my own, because you make so many choices through this game, and it seems like even if it's in some small way, those things tend to add up. I will say that choices I made in the main story played a part later in the game. Even there was one side mission I did where there were these two people escaping my homeland. They were on this island, and I helped them, and I did multiple tasks to help them. And then that came back once. It helped me resolve an issue without fighting, which was nice, saved me some time. And then another time, these people showed up in another place and gave me a nice reward. So, it's basic RPG stuff, but it's kind of like Obsidian stopped and said, okay, what are the five things about these high aesthetic or these high fantasy kind of medieval aesthetic RPGs, like what are the things people like the most? And they took like the top five things and just completely focused on that and made a really compelling, interesting, fun game. There's tons of nitpicks. The game is so curious because its art direction is amazing, so it's very beautiful in a lot of ways. But then, like they, I'm sure it's, I don't want to say stock textures and things like that, but it's not the most high fidelity graphics you're ever going to see. But it's really a good reminder of that whole thing to realize is that just because something has 4K textures and runs at 120 FPS or has these crazy mechanics doesn't necessarily mean the game's going to be good. And instead, we have a game like Avowed that definitely cut tons of corners. They might not have even cut corners. They never intended on going around that turn at all. And that's what happens. And so it's been frustrating for me to see some reviews where people are so stuck on, there's no romance and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, you're fixated on the things this game isn't and never claimed to be. I believe the developers made it pretty clear that there was no intent to have relationships in this game, even though from what I've seen, you can kind of like touch on romance, but never actually go or follow through with it from what I've seen. Um, but yeah, just a great game. I rolled credits. I really enjoyed the story. I liked how it wrapped up. And I'm so curious to see how many different endings there are. Kind of funny, had kind of an interesting interview. I suggest heavily going to actually watch it with Matt Piscatella. He's part of the former MPD group. I forget what they're even called, Circana or something maybe now. And he's a games industry analyst. And what I've always really liked about Piscatella is that for the most part, everyone has their faults, but for the most part, he seems like he's kept his like bias in check, and he just kind of talks about the numbers and even acknowledges that many of the numbers that they get about PlayStation games sold or Xbox consoles sold, that those things are not the entire truth, because they don't get reporting from every single source that sells those things. And I thought that was a good thing. Hopefully enough people saw him talking about that to realize that it's maybe not as big of a deal as it seems sometimes. I think what I took from this interview, which I do suggest you actually watch, I'm not going to summarize every point here. It was interesting when he started talking about platforms and hardware and all of that, where he, in my opinion, basically said what Phil Spencer's been saying for years at this point of, there's still a need for hardware, but that's not the driving force behind the industry anymore. And it kind of hasn't been for a while. All of the reports, depending on who you talk to, is I believe it's like the PlayStation 5 is selling more than it's like 7% more than the PlayStation 4 at the same time since release. And I see a lot of people being like celebrating that, especially on the kind of console war side of things. But if you think about it a little more, there's a pretty good chance the world, that and we experience this as well. The game industry has grown more than 7% in the last 10 or 15 years or whatever. So it's cool that they're selling more PlayStation 5s than 4s, but it's not really tracking with the growth of the industry. And it does mean that things aren't selling as well as they were. It's the idea that if they sold at this point, say 10 million PlayStation 4s, and now you're selling like 10 million and 500,000 PS4s, like that is a jump for sure, but maybe it's not the big jump that you were hoping for or felt like you needed for the safety of your country and the economy and such, or just your own company. So yeah, his conversation was really interesting. They were talking about multi-platform games and how that's the way of the future, and locking your games down to one system isn't really probably going to be as lucrative as it once was. That there is the whole conversation of like Square Enix is famous for it at this point, that their single releases on just PlayStation, Final Fantasy Rebirth being the big conversation today, that it didn't really sell that well, at least not well for the type of IP that is and the legacy it has. Square Enix was probably counting on that sale, and it didn't really do that well, or at least it just did okay. So I think I just, more than anything, I think you should just check out this interview. It was really, really good, very informative. I wish more people had the curiosity to check out such things, so that they don't say silly things when they're discussing video games on the internet, and that includes me. We have Rainbow Six Siege has their X showcase on March 13th. There were rumors at one point that they were putting out a Siege 2. This seems to just be a big reboot to the series. We'll have to see how it plays out in the long run. I played some Siege back in the day. It was neat. I have no idea how people are still playing that game. It has been a long time since I've played that game, and it was neat. I enjoyed my time with it, but man, good for them if they're still enjoying it. I'm glad you're getting a big reboot, even though I think would probably have been better to do a new game, but they know better than I do. And then the final thing here, we have Saber Interactive, who just put out Space Marine 2, is working with Hasbro on a tentpole IP that has not yet been revealed. I mean, my first thought goes to Baldur's Gate 4. And then I think about the games that Saber has made, and that makes no sense at all. Like, why would they make that game? It's so outside of their wheelhouse. The only way I think it could be Baldur's Gate is if Baldur's Gate 4 or whatever the next Baldur's Gate game is a complete departure from being the CRPG. Maybe it turns into more of an action game set in that same world or something. I have no idea. Or maybe they're working on a different IP from Hasbro entirely. Maybe it has nothing to do with that game. And yeah, we'll just have to wait and see. I still have this pipe dream that Larian is working on their current project. They'll be putting it out, I assume, here in a couple of years, and that they will hopefully maybe consider doing Baldur's Gate 4 then. We know they talked a lot about how they were just burned out on Baldur's Gate, and they started the idea of DLC and an expansion and a sequel, and as they started to dive into them, realized that their heart just wasn't in it, and that's a real shame, because I would have loved to get another, even just an expansion, but especially a Baldur's Gate 4 from Larian would be the dream, and I suspect that is probably not going to be the case, at least not any time soon. As for some content updates, the only real thing is I'm super duper slammed at work. Very, very busy right now. I will be for the next month or so. So I should be able to keep recording this podcast. The streams will become pretty rare, if at all. And even, like making videos and stuff for YouTube will probably slow down. I'll try to get one out a week at least. So be sure to go over there and check those things out just to make sure that you can see what I'm trying to put out there. So that is where I'm going to wrap this one up. It was a short show this week. There wasn't anything real huge I wanted to talk about. Hopefully nothing popped up as I was recording. But if it did, we'll talk about it next week. If you have any questions or feedback for the show, be sure to comment on the Spotify or YouTube episodes. Let me know in my Discord, which you can get a link for in the description of the show, or hit me up on social media at Bondiesel or at the Baunfire. Thank you so much for listening to the whole show. Please consider supporting via the links in the show description. That is all I have for this episode of the Baunfire Gaming Podcast. So, until next time.